She splashed dirty water on an old beggar, unaware she is her billionaire fiancé's mother. The crowd gathered along the sidewalk was not there for her. Yet when the gleaming Rolls-Royce pulled up to the curb, every pair of eyes was drawn to it. The polished chrome reflected the late afternoon sun, dazzling the street with flashes of brilliance, while the quiet purr of the engine seemed to hum with superiority. The driver stepped out first, dressed in a dark suit, his movements brisk and deferential. He circled around the car, pulled the handle with a practiced flourish, and swung the door open. Out she stepped, one high-heeled shoe pressing gracefully against the pavement, then the other. The woman's pale skin glowed under the light, her blonde hair styled into soft waves that framed her face with deliberate perfection. A fitted dress of the finest fabric hugged her figure, its color bold enough to command attention without ever veering into gaudiness. Around her neck sparkled a necklace of diamonds, each gem catching the light and scattering it into tiny stars across the pavement. Her sunglasses, dark and wide, shielded her eyes but not the confidence that radiated from her. She tilted her chin high, lips curving with the faintest suggestion of superiority. Passers-by slowed their steps to watch, caught in the orbit of her presence. Some whispered, admiring the luxury, envying the poise. Others frowned quietly, but could not look away. Children tugged at their mothers' sleeves to ask who she was, and mothers replied with soft tones, naming her as one of the women who seemed born for money, her life paved with red carpets even on ordinary streets. She did not look at them. To her, they were background, part of the scenery through which she glided like a queen among peasants. Her heels clicked lightly against the stone as she walked forward, the Rolls-Royce gleaming silently behind her. The driver remained at the car, standing at attention as if ready to shield her from the slightest inconvenience. She adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist, each movement deliberate, meant to be seen. The scent of her perfume drifted through the air, delicate yet commanding, leaving those near her both enthralled and intimidated. A young couple paused nearby, their eyes fixed on her. The woman clutched her partner's arm tightly, whispering about the elegance of her dress. The way it seemed tailored not just to her body, but to her power. The man nodded, his eyes lingering on the car, the symbol of wealth that seemed to hum with disdain for anyone who could not afford it. The woman from the Rolls-Royce moved as though the world bent to her pace. Every step carried the weight of entitlement, every tilt of her head, a dismissal of those around her. To the crowd she was beauty and power personified, a symbol of wealth so brazen it demanded respect. And with her head held high, she accepted their gaze as nothing more than her due, never once imagining that her arrogance would soon lead her to a humiliation that all would remember. The roadside was alive with footsteps and chatter, a stream of people passing through the day with their minds on errands, meetings, and dinners waiting at home. Yet on the cracked pavement, leaning against the cold stone wall, sat an old black woman whose presence most overlooked. Her back was slightly bent from years of carrying burdens both visible and invisible. Her hands, thin and worn, rested on her knees, palms turned upward in a gesture as old as humanity itself. Her voice was soft, fragile, barely rising above the noise of the street as she whispered her plea for help. Her clothes spoke before she did. The fabric was faded, nearly to grey, seams frayed, patches sewn over holes that had torn again. Her shoes had long since lost their shape, soles flapping slightly when she shifted her feet. Around her shoulders hung a shawl that might once have been warm but was now little more than threadbare cloth. Her face was lined deeply, not just with age but with hardship etched into every crease. Her eyes, however, though tired, still carried a glimmer of dignity, a quiet strength that no misfortune had managed to erase. Passers-by rarely looked at her directly. A man in a suit glanced her way, frowned faintly, and walked faster, muttering something under his breath. A young woman carrying shopping bags shifted her path slightly, unwilling to brush against the beggar's shoulder. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, asking innocent questions, only to be hushed quickly and pulled along. Most averted their eyes, pretending they had not heard the old woman's soft plea. "Please, just a little help," she whispered, her voice cracking. She did not reach out her hand rudely, nor did she demand. She asked with humility, her words carrying a weight of need that made the few who listened uncomfortable. At her feet lay a small tin can, dented and dull, with only a few coins rattling inside. Some who passed dropped in a token coin without slowing their pace, eager to quiet their conscience but unwilling to truly see her. The sound of each coin striking the bottom echoed briefly, but the silence afterward pressed heavier than the momentary kindness. The sun shifted higher, casting a harsh glow over her, yet she did not rise. Her bones ached, her body weary, and still she sat, repeating her request, as though hope itself depended on the act of asking. The street seemed indifferent, life surging around her without pause, but those who happened to look too long could not deny the quiet power of her presence. She was frail, weary, and ignored. Yet she held her head just high enough to show that though poverty had stripped her of comfort, it had not robbed her of humanity. She sat in her corner of the world, dignified even in despair, a silent test for every soul who passed her by. Most failed without realizing it, walking on quickly, whispering judgments, or shaking their heads. She remained where she was, steady as stone, her plea carried gently on the wind. The Rolls-Royce gleamed in the sunlight, its polished surface like a mirror reflecting the crowded street. The white woman stood beside it, draped in her elegant gown, her diamonds flashing as she adjusted her bracelets. Her lips curled in distaste as her eyes landed on the old black woman sitting only a few feet away. The beggar's worn shawl, her frail posture, and the small tin can by her side seemed like a stain against the backdrop of luxury that surrounded the car. The woman's irritation was immediate, her sense of superiority pricked by the sight of poverty so close to her world. With a flick of her hand, she turned to her driver. "Get rid of her," she said coldly, her voice carrying the sharpness of command rather than request. The driver hesitated, glancing at the beggar, who sat silently, her palms still open in humble plea. His eyes softened for a moment, but the woman's glare cut into him, and he stepped forward awkwardly, gesturing for the old woman to move along. The beggar looked up, her tired eyes full of dignity despite her exhaustion. She did not argue, only shifted slightly as though she might stand, but her body was heavy, her bones unwilling to rise so quickly. The hesitation only fueled the white woman's anger. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement as she stormed toward the beggar, her movements quick and filled with disdain. She grabbed a bucket that had been left near a flower vendor, its water murky from rinsed stems and soil. Without hesitation, without even considering the gasps already rising from those nearby, she flung the water over the seated woman. The splash was harsh, drenching the beggar's clothes and soaking into her thin shawl. The old woman gasped, shivering as the dirty water trickled down her arms and legs, the coins in her tin can rattling as her hands shook. Yet even in humiliation, she did not lash out. She simply looked down, her silence carrying a weight heavier than any words. Onlookers stopped in their tracks. A mother covered her child's eyes, whispering sharply about cruelty. A man near the corner shook his head, muttering that this was shameful. Yet none dared step forward. They stood frozen, horrified, as the white woman's laughter rang through the street. She tilted her head back, smiling proudly, as if she had accomplished something clever. The beggar bowed her head lower, her dignity wrapped tightly around her like armor, even as her clothes clung damply to her frail body. Around them, the street murmured, disbelief and pity, mixing in equal measure. The Rolls-Royce loomed behind the woman like a throne, its gleam now tainted by the ugliness of the act. The cruel laughter still echoed, but beneath it grew a silence that hinted the story of this moment would not remain on this street alone. It would be carried, retold, and remembered as the day arrogance splashed water on dignity. The street was still buzzing with noise, but the cruel laughter that had followed the splash seemed to hang heavier than the sound of footsteps or chatter. People had seen what happened, and though none of them had stepped forward, their disapproval was clear in the way their eyes narrowed and their mouths pressed into thin lines. A woman carrying a basket shook her head slowly, whispering to the man walking beside her that it was a disgrace. The man muttered back that it was shameful to humiliate someone who was already struggling, yet neither moved closer. By the flower stall, a young mother clutched her child's hand and pulled him behind her. The boy had seen the water splash, and the old black woman's clothes sag with the weight of the dirty water. His innocent eyes were wide with confusion, and he whispered a question his mother silenced quickly, shushing him and steering him away, afraid that even sympathy might draw unwanted attention. A group of men leaning against the wall exchanged glances, their faces hard but their bodies still. One spat onto the ground, shaking his head with disgust, but even he did not find the courage to step in. The cruelty was obvious, but so was the fear of speaking against someone whose car alone could buy a dozen of their homes. The beggar sat where she had been, drenched and cold, her frail hands brushing the water from her lap as best she could. Her eyes did not rise to meet the crowd. Instead, she bowed her head slightly, swallowing the insult with the same quiet endurance she had carried through years of hardship. Her dignity clung to her, even as the dirty water clung to her shawl. She did not beg again, did not plead, did not shout. She remained still, her silence more powerful than any cry for pity. The driver of the Rolls-Royce shifted uneasily, his eyes darting toward the people gathered, sensing their judgment. Yet he, too, said nothing. He returned to his place by the car, folding his hands behind his back, trying to stand like stone while inside he battled with the shame of obedience. Onlookers began to disperse slowly, some whispering under their breath, others carrying the story away with them, certain it would be repeated by evening. They did not intervene, but their faces carried the weight of what they had witnessed. Arrogance had revealed itself in the harshest light, and humility had met it, without surrender. The old woman remained where she was, soaked but composed, her silence echoing louder than the laughter that had humiliated her. And though no one reached for her hand, every person who passed would remember her stillness, the quiet proof that dignity does not vanish even when the world splashes it with cruelty. The street was alive with murmurs when the sleek black car pulled up behind the Rolls-Royce. Its presence commanded silence, the kind that ripples outward as people sense something important about to unfold. The driver stepped out swiftly, opening the door with practiced precision, and from within emerged the billionaire. His presence was unmistakable. Tall, elegant, his silver cufflinks gleaming in the sunlight, he carried himself with the calm composure of a man accustomed to control. His suit was tailored to perfection, his shoes polished, every detail speaking of quiet power rather than flamboyant wealth. The white woman's face lit up instantly. She smoothed her hair, straightened her dress, and stepped forward with an eagerness that contrasted sharply with the disdain she had shown only moments before. "Darling," she called out, her voice warm and polished, meant to charm. She moved quickly to his side, looping her arm through his as if to claim him in front of the crowd. Her smile was radiant, her laugh deliberate, designed to assure onlookers that she belonged in his world of elegance and fortune. The billionaire greeted her with a polite smile, though his eyes seemed distant, distracted. He offered her a nod, a soft word of acknowledgement, but something in his gaze had already shifted. For as he stood beside her, his eyes fell upon the drenched figure sitting quietly by the roadside. The beggar's frail frame was hunched forward, her tattered shawl clinging to her skin, still heavy with dirty water. Her hands trembled faintly as she tried to smooth the soaked fabric over her lap, as if even now she sought to preserve what little dignity remained to her. The tin can at her feet rattled softly when her knee brushed against it, the few coins inside echoing like an accusation in the silence. The billionaire's expression changed at once. The warmth in his face evaporated, his polite smile slipping away. His eyes widened slightly, his jaw tightened, and a shadow crossed his features as he stepped instinctively toward the old black woman. The white woman at his side faltered, her own smile dimming as she watched his attention shift. She tugged at his arm, but he did not respond. Onlookers sensed the turn. The murmurs grew louder, people whispering to one another as they noted the way his focus had left the glittering woman at his side and settled fully on the frail figure in rags. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he crossed the few steps that separated him from the beggar. The crowd held its breath, unsure of what they were witnessing. The white woman's eyes darted nervously between him and the beggar. Her laughter, which had been bold and ringing only moments earlier, now felt brittle in her throat. She forced another smile, but the mask was beginning to crack. For the first time, she realized she had no control over the scene. The billionaire lowered himself slightly, his elegant frame bending, as he leaned toward the old woman. His voice was quiet, almost trembling with emotion, as he spoke her name. The beggar lifted her head, and in that moment, the truth was written on his face. The joy of arrival had vanished, replaced by something heavier, something deeper, as recognition settled into his eyes. The crowd had been watching with growing curiosity, their whispers circling like restless wind, but when the billionaire moved, everything fell silent. He stepped away from the gleaming Rolls-Royce, away from the trembling hand of the woman who had moments ago clung to his arm, and hurried toward the frail figure hunched by the roadside. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement, urgency in every stride. Without hesitation, he lowered himself onto one knee beside the drenched beggar. The man who had been so composed and regal moments earlier now bent in reverence before a woman most had dismissed. "Mother," he said, his voice breaking the silence with tenderness that carried across the crowd. His hand reached for hers, unbothered by the dirt or the water that stained her shawl. His eyes, usually calm and commanding, now shone with emotion as he held her trembling fingers gently in his own. The old black woman lifted her head slowly, her lined face wet not only with dirty water but with the tears that had begun to gather in her eyes. For a moment she looked at him in disbelief. Then her lips curved into the faintest smile, as though she had known all along that he would see her. She whispered his name, and the way he leaned closer, pressing her knuckles against his forehead, spoke louder than any declaration could. A collective gasp rippled through the bystanders. A woman dropped the basket she was carrying, its contents scattering across the pavement. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, staring wide-eyed. Men exchanged shocked glances, unable to reconcile the picture before them. A billionaire kneeling at the feet of a beggar. His voice filled with reverence. The air was thick with astonishment, and the whispers began again, this time carrying words of wonder. The white woman froze. Her painted smile fell away, leaving only the hollow mask of horror etched across her pale face. Her hand, still raised slightly in a gesture of possession, dropped uselessly to her side. She stared at the scene with wide eyes, her mind racing, every drop of blood draining from her cheeks. Only moments earlier she had laughed as she humiliated the old woman, certain of her superiority, certain no one would dare challenge her cruelty. Now the truth stood before her, undeniable and devastating. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came. The laughter she had used as a weapon now seemed grotesque in her memory, echoing back to her as an indictment. The crowd's eyes shifted from the billionaire to her, and in those stares she felt the full weight of her exposure. She took a small step backward, but there was no escape. Her shame clung to her more tightly than the jewels at her throat. The billionaire ignored her entirely. His world, in that moment, was his mother. He brushed damp strands of hair from her face, murmuring softly, words too quiet for others to hear. His gesture alone, the way he lifted her hand and kissed it with reverence, was enough to speak to everyone watching. Love and respect radiated from him, humbling the proud and silencing the cruel. The lesson had begun, and every witness knew they would carry the image of that moment for the rest of their lives. The murmurs of the crowd swelled as the old black woman slowly lifted her chin, her voice fragile yet steady. She spoke softly, but each word seemed to travel farther than the noise of the street. She told them she had chosen to live humbly, away from the glittering towers her son could have given her, because she wanted her life to be her own. She explained that wealth could surround her with walls of comfort but would never erase the lessons she had carried through hardship, the value of work, and the strength of humility. She smiled faintly as she spoke of her son, her pride evident, but she admitted she never wanted to be seen as a trophy of his success. She wished instead to walk among people as herself, without diamonds or guards, without the shields money could buy. The billionaire listened closely, his hand still resting on hers, his expression filled with reverence. The dignity in her words deepened the shame, already pressing on the onlookers. Here was a woman who had been mocked, humiliated, drenched in dirty water, and yet she spoke with more grace than any of those who had judged her. Her quiet voice carried more power than the roar of engines or the sparkle of jewels. Then he rose to his full height, his eyes dark as they turned toward the woman who had only minutes before laughed at his mother's suffering. His voice, calm yet sharp as a blade, cut through the air. He demanded to know how she could do such a thing, how she could humiliate an old woman with such cruelty. He asked her, what part of her heart found joy in mocking the weary, what part of her soul could pour dirty water onto dignity itself. The white woman stammered, her confidence shattered. The arrogance that once held her chin high was gone, replaced with trembling lips and darting eyes. She tried to form words, muttering about not knowing who the beggar was, claiming it was only a joke, but the excuses collapsed under the weight of her own cruelty. The crowd did not believe her. Their eyes burned into her, their silence harsher than any shouted condemnation. Her hands fluttered helplessly at her sides, her jewels clinking as though mocking her desperation. She looked at the billionaire, searching for softness in his eyes, but found only cold disappointment. She tried again to speak, her voice cracking, but the sound was hollow. Nothing she said could erase what the crowd had seen with their own eyes. Nothing she said could wash away the stain of her laughter. The old mother lowered her gaze again, saying nothing now. Her son's hand tightened at her shoulder, his stance protective and firm. The silence from the billionaire was heavier than his words had been. The fiancé's stammering dwindled into nothing, her face paling as she realized the truth. No wealth, no beauty, no car could shield her now. She had revealed herself, and there was no undoing it. The whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd, sharp and relentless. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the woman who only minutes earlier had laughed with such cruel confidence. Now her laughter was gone, replaced by a face drained of color as the weight of exposure pressed down on her. People leaned toward one another, their voices urgent, furious, carried on the air for everyone to hear. Some called her heartless, others spat the word arrogant. Mothers who had clutched their children earlier whispered that this was what pride led to, a downfall so swift it left no room to recover. Phones were raised discreetly at first, then openly. Screens glowed as bystanders recorded the scene, capturing her disgrace from every angle. The thought of her act being shared, replayed, passed from hand to hand in endless shame, made her hands tremble. She tried to straighten her posture, but the eyes on her burned too hot. The muttering grew into a storm of judgment, and she could feel her reputation dissolving under it. Her chest rose and fell quickly, panic clawing at her, but still she tried to wear her mask. She lifted her chin only to drop it again, unable to meet the gaze of the man she had hoped to marry. The billionaire stood firm, his arm protective around his mother, his expression unreadable but cold. The contrast between his strength and her unraveling made the onlookers even harsher in their whispers. She raised her hands to her face, covering it as if she could hide from their judgment. Her diamonds glittered even in that moment, a cruel reminder of the wealth she had flaunted, now worthless against the tide of shame. The crowd did not look away. They stared as though watching a spectacle, one they knew would be spoken of long after this day was done. She realized then, in the way they recorded her, in the way they pointed and shook their heads, that she had not only lost her dignity, but her future. The engagement she had clung to as her crowning jewel was gone, shattered in the eyes of everyone present. The man she had tried to impress with elegance and charm now looked at her with nothing but disappointment. The murmurs grew sharper, people openly condemning her, some saying she deserved worse, others calling it justice. She wanted to flee, to sink into the ground and vanish, but her body would not move. The laughter she had once used to assert dominance now echoed in her mind like a curse, a sound she could not escape. Her arrogance collapsed fully in that moment, leaving nothing but a hollow shell of the woman who had stepped so proudly out of the Rolls-Royce. All that remained was disgrace, witnessed by many, and soon to be known by more. She pressed her hands tighter to her face, as if blocking out the sight of her ruin, but no gesture could undo what had been revealed. The world had seen her cruelty, and now it watched her fall. The billionaire's voice rose above the whispers of the crowd, steady and unyielding. His eyes no longer lingered on the trembling woman who stood beside the gleaming Rolls-Royce. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the mother at his side, her frail hands still damp from the cruel splash of dirty water, her dignity intact even through humiliation. He wrapped his arm around her gently, guiding her closer, as though to shield her from every eye that had watched her suffering. The silence deepened, broken only by the occasional click of a phone camera. Then, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, he turned to the woman he had once called his fiancée. His voice was calm but sharp enough to slice through the air. He told her the engagement was over, that he would not marry someone who had shown such heartlessness. He declared that cruelty dressed in silk was still cruelty, and arrogance coated in diamonds was still arrogance. The white woman gasped, her face blanching, her lips trembling as she tried to protest. She stammered, searching for excuses, her voice faltering under the weight of the moment. She spoke of misunderstanding, of ignorance, but her words rang hollow, collapsing as quickly as they formed. No one in the crowd believed her, and she knew it. The man she had hoped to bind herself to, the symbol of power she had coveted, now looked at her with nothing but cold finality. He shifted his gaze back to his mother, his expression softening once more. His words flowed with conviction as he declared that kindness and humility mattered more to him than beauty or wealth. He spoke of the lessons his mother had taught him, the values she had instilled, long before success and riches surrounded him. He said she was his compass, the one who reminded him of who he was and what he stood for, and no act of cruelty could ever erase that. The crowd erupted in murmurs again, this time not with anger but with approval. Some nodded, others even clapped softly, moved by the clarity of his decision. The image of him embracing his mother, choosing her dignity over his fiancée's vanity, spread like a fire among the witnesses. Phones captured the moment, ensuring it would not be confined to that street alone. The former fiancé covered her face, her jewels clinking faintly as she turned away, her pride shattered, her name tarnished beyond repair. The billionaire ignored her retreat. He bent down and kissed his mother's forehead, holding her tightly as though nothing else mattered. His voice lowered, but those close enough heard him vow that she would never again endure humiliation at the hands of anyone. In that embrace, the lesson was carved into the memory of all who watched. Wealth and beauty fade, but character endures. And in choosing his mother's quiet strength over the shallow cruelty of his fiancée, the billionaire reminded everyone that true worth is measured not by appearance or fortune but by the heart. The story did not end on the street where it began. By the time the sun dipped behind the rooftops, whispers had already traveled far beyond the cluster of bystanders who had witnessed the humiliation and the revelation. People in shops repeated it in hushed voices, embellishing details as they passed it along. Taxi drivers told it to their passengers, each word punctuated with a shake of the head or a knowing nod. In office buildings and market stalls, the tale gained weight, growing into a parable that everyone seemed eager to retell. They spoke of the old black woman, drenched in dirty water, yet unbroken in her dignity. They described how she had bowed her head, not in defeat but in quiet strength, refusing to surrender her humanity even when mocked. Her restraint became the centerpiece of the story, the lesson that radiated beyond her frail body. She had been poor, her clothes worn thin, but her grace had shone brighter than diamonds. Those who heard the tale began to repeat it with admiration, calling her strong, wise, and unshakable. Equally, they spoke of the cruel white woman, once so admired for her beauty and her luxury, now remembered only for her arrogance. They told of how she had stepped out of her Rolls-Royce with her chin high, only to collapse in shame before the eyes of the crowd. Her jewels, once a symbol of status, became a symbol of wasted vanity, shining pointlessly while her character rotted underneath. Wherever her name was spoken, it carried the weight of ridicule. People shook their heads at her downfall, reminding one another that pride always leads to ruin. The billionaire's decisions spread with equal force. People marveled that he had ended the engagement on the spot, that he had chosen his mother's dignity over wealth and beauty. His words, repeated again and again, became a mantra in the city. Kindness and humility mean more than riches. Parents told their children the story not just as gossip but as a lesson. Teachers repeated it in classrooms, pointing to it as proof that arrogance blinds and that true worth is never seen in clothes or cars but in actions. By nightfall, the story had become legend. The city carried it on every corner, retelling it as if it had always been known. The old black mother was lifted up as a figure of quiet greatness, her grace admired, her dignity respected. The cruel woman faded into infamy, remembered not for her beauty or her wealth but for the moment her arrogance was revealed to the world. And though the crowd eventually dispersed and the Rolls-Royce drove away, the lesson remained, carved into the memory of everyone who heard it. Dignity shines even in rags, and arrogance, no matter how it sparkles, always wastes itself in the end.